Kentucky basketball has a massive showdown with the Florida Gators, and I think the Wildcats are ready to take on this challenge.
You are Locked On Kentucky, your daily podcast on the Kentucky Wildcats, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, what's going on, Big Blue Nation? Welcome on into Locked On Kentucky, your daily Kentucky Wildcats podcast. I'm your host, Lance Dawe, writer for Sports Illustrated for various SEC-related things. But on this podcast, we take a dive into all things Kentucky athletics. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. You can download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDON for $20 off your first purchase. On today's episode of Locked On Kentucky, we are going to be previewing the biggest game of the year in my mind up until this point, Kentucky versus Florida. Obviously, we've kind of gone back and forth here on the show for the past couple of weeks saying that everything's leading up to this. If you beat North Carolina, the Wildcats did. Here come the Gators, going to be a big-time matchup for UK to prove a lot of different things about this squad. Going to break this matchup down on today's episode. Thank you so much for making Locked On Kentucky your first listen every single day. I want to remind everyone out there that we are free and available on all platforms. If you have not subscribed to the show already, please go ahead and do so. If you're listening on podcast, please subscribe wherever you are tuned in as well. So let's go ahead and get into it. Kentucky versus Florida. Why do I say that this is the biggest matchup of the season for UK up until this point? Obviously, you had a big game against Kansas, big game against North Carolina, but this one against the Florida Gators is very interesting for a couple of reasons, some of which have to do with the personnel with the Gators and stylistically how they choose to attack, which we will dive into. But for Kentucky, it's a little bit different than those matchups against the Jayhawks and the Tar Heels because of the fact that this one is at a true road venue. The Wildcats have not gotten an opportunity to take on a legitimate team on the road this season, and no, we're not counting Louisville. That environment did not really give the Wildcats an opportunity to be truly, I think, affected as they will possibly be this weekend in Gainesville. So I think that this one for UK, it's a quad one opportunity. Obviously, it can boost your resume, but what it does for you on your schedule, it really sets the tone for you mentally, how you are going to approach road games from here on out. This is where men are made. This is conference play. Kentucky's got a huge test, and I understand that the Gators are not the most elite team in the country, but they've got some really interesting pieces and a really interesting rotation. Todd Golden, formerly at San Francisco, before that an assistant coach at Auburn, has a really interesting approach to his style of play, and this year I think he's got a very balanced team. So it's going to give Kentucky a lot. I think they will have problems in this game. I think that there will be moments where the Gators do shine through because of their environment, because of their personnel. But at the end of the day, I think that we are looking to see how Kentucky acts and responds following this game, because this, I think, could possibly be a turning point or an even, I think, a momentum builder for the Wildcats. So what about the Florida Gators is interesting? Let's dive into some of the different things that we know about UF. As we previously discussed just a few episodes ago, where I was previewing every single SEC team and I was giving you 5 different things you need to know about them and a couple of different things about stats, about players, about their schedule, wins, losses, and that. I'm just going to kind of dive into that again with UF today because not much has changed since you and I last spoke about them. They defeated Michigan 106-101 in double overtime just a few weeks ago, but since then they've played Grambling State and Quinnipiac, and they beat both of those teams handily in both of those matchups. So nothing has really changed, I don't think, about the Florida Gators. They've defeated 2 top 50 opponents in the KenPom ratings, according to, again, the KenPom ratings. Wow. Great sentence structure there, Lance. They've defeated Pittsburgh and Michigan, like I just mentioned, but they have lost to Virginia, Baylor, and Wake Forest, all of those in relatively close games. They lost to Virginia, second game of the season, by 3. They lost to Baylor by 4, and Baylor is a pretty good offensive team. They lost 95-91, and then they lost to Wake Forest 82-71. I think the big thing that we need to tackle here when talking about what the Florida Gators are is I think they are offensively improved from where they were a season ago. They were just inside, I think, the top 140 in adjusted offensive efficiency on KenPom last year. This year, they're in the top 35, and I think it has to do with what we've talked about on a couple of different recent episodes, their ability to offensively or to give themselves second chance points and grab offensive rebounds. You look at the few different games that they have played, that they've been close in, that have been against really good teams. Virginia, Pittsburgh, Baylor, Wake Forest, Michigan. In all of those games, they did one of two things. They either scored at a very high rate, 91 points against Baylor, 70 points against Virginia is impressive, 106 against Michigan, and then you also have, 86 against Pittsburgh as well. They can offensively run with you if you want to take it in that direction, which is interesting because of the matchup that they face today, or excuse me, not today. You may be watching this on Saturday. It'll be interesting because of the matchup they get today against the Wildcats, and I think this is easily the best offense that they have seen so far this season. It's going to be interesting to see if the Gators can, with their stronger offense this season, keep up with Kentucky better than they have in the past couple of seasons. So that's the first thing we need to note about Florida, is offensively, they're a little bit different, and they are a lot more fun, and they've been able to compete in games against teams that want to score the rock. What else do we know about this Florida offense and this team as a whole? Well, they like to play with a little bit of tempo, as do the Kentucky Wildcats. According to KenPom, Florida is 13th nationally in adjusted tempo overall and 11th nationally in average possession length on offense, which is just a little bit faster, actually, than what Kentucky likes to do. So stylistically, this Florida team is rejuvenated compared to where they were underneath Mike White and in their first season with Todd Golden. I think personnel slightly dictated the pace of what they wanted to do, Colin Castleton being the primary scorer and contributor on last year's team. This year, not here. A more balanced roster, I would argue. But they're fun. They're fresh. They're new. They've won a couple of solid games. They've been really close against some other good opponents in Virginia, Baylor, and Wake Forest. But they get this Kentucky team at home. And all three of their losses this year, the Gators are 10-3 on the season. All three of their losses are either at neutral sites or just straight up on the road. That Wake Forest loss being in the ACC SEC Challenge. So it's a new day, I think, in Gainesville with Todd Golden, and I think he's got them trending in the right direction. Defensively, I don't like a lot of different things that I see about the Florida Gators. Statistically, they're not bad. They're actually right around the same spot that Kentucky is in adjusted efficiency. They're in the top 60 nationally. They're solid in effective field goal percentage. They don't create a lot of turnovers, which Kentucky doesn't give up a lot to begin with. They don't really give up a lot from 3-2 or the foul line. There's not like a large discrepancy. It's kind of even across the board. Pretty average relative to college basketball's averages. And they're pretty solid as well in terms of just holding opponents from distributing the basketball well, getting a lot of assists, and then overall their 2-point percentage, their interior defense has been very solid so far this season. But there are different things across the board that it's just like they're not necessarily elite in, they're not necessarily okay in, they're just kind of average relative to the standards of the SEC, I should say, at least from a numbers perspective. So offensively, fun, fast, creative, balanced. Defensively, strong inside at the rim and block percentage and 2-point percentage, but outside of that, relatively average to okay, good across the board in other areas. The personnel that we need to talk about here about the Gators. I think the MVP that I had for that episode where we broke down the 5 different things you need to know about each SEC team, Zion Pullen was the first guy that I mentioned. 14 points per game, leads the team in assist at 5.1. He had 22 points in that overtime win against Michigan. He is a very solid player for them, shoots 42.9% from deep, but he's the third leading scorer on the squad that averages 86 a game. Tyrese Samuel, a forward here for the Gators, will also be somebody to watch. Not a great three-point shooter, but very efficient inside the arc. And then Walter Clayton Jr., the most dominant ball handler on this team when it comes to scoring, distributing, etc. 15.2 points on pretty, I would say, slightly above average numbers, 45.7% from the floor, 35.1% from deep. But it's interesting, their top 5 scorers all score at least 11 points or more. Riley Kugel, not the most efficient shooter this year, bit of a different disappointment. And then Will Richard at almost 12 points per contest. Pretty solid three-point shooter as well. Across the board, though, like I mentioned, 5 guys that are averaging double figures. And if you go to KenPom, again, I love KenPom, you will see, looking at the depth charts, looking at these different players, KenPom will break them up into various categories. They'll break them up into significant contributors. They will break them up into role players, limited roles, nearly invisible, and bench warmers. And I believe if you have a guy that is handling the ball more than everybody else, above significant contributors, you can have go-to guys. Florida does not have a single player in the go-to guys section, which I believe that requires them to be used on, I think, like 25% or more of possessions. But Florida doesn't have a significant, they don't have a go-to guy, but they've got 5 significant contributors, which is not common. In fact, we can go to Kentucky's page here real quick and look at the Wildcats. They have one go-to guy in Rob Dillingham, who is used on 29% of possessions. Then they have 2 significant contributors, 20 to 24% of possessions used. Then they have 4 role players if you include Bradshaw, 1 in limited roles, and then 1 in nearly invisible, which is Jordan Burks. But Florida has half of their rotation all there in significant contributors, somewhere between 20 and 24% of possessions used. 4 of those guys are starters. So it's a team that dives into their bench about average, but their starters really do make up a lot of what they like to do. Walter Clayton, Tyrese Samuel, Riley Kugel, Zion Pullen, and Will Richard. Tyrese Samuel is your starting forward, but I think the interesting thing about the Gators is that they have a lot of height and they rotate their guys in. Alex, I don't know if it's Condon or Condon. He is a 6'11" freshman off the bench for the Gators, and he is averaging, I believe, just a shade over 8 points per game and 19 minutes per contest. He's averaging almost a block and a half per game as well. 6.8 rebounds, very productive in his limited minutes. And he's sitting behind Tyrese Samuel, who is the second leading scorer on this team. You've got 2 guys that are 6'10 plus, and that's not where it ends. It continues. You've got Micah Handglotton, the transfer from Marshall. If you listen to my show back in, I believe, early summer, we talked about this guy as somebody that the Wildcats may be interested in picking up. He's been kind of a role player for them so far this season, but the depth chart over the past 5 games indicates that he's been the primary go-to guy at center. So you've got Samuel, you've got Condon, you've got Richard, you've got Handglotton, who is at 7'1", by the way. You've got several guys in this rotation. I haven't even talked about Thomas Hall, who is 6'9", also that gets into this rotation a little bit as well. So you've got so many different guys that you can go to. You play fast, you get to the rim aggressively, you score well inside the arc. Florida overall is an average shooting team from outside the arc. They don't shoot well from the foul line. They get to the foul line a lot. So if they were able to produce a little bit more from the free throw line, if they were able to shoot at a higher clip, they would probably be a more efficient offense overall. So it's really interesting. Florida's just a really interesting team. I think I was on the phone with somebody yesterday, and I was talking about Florida, and they were just asking how to describe them and stuff like that. And I said, based on their numbers and based on watching them, go and watch that Michigan game. They can be better than what they have been. I think they have a higher ceiling than what they have reached so far. But they need to be more consistent for shooting from the line, and they need to do a better job of protecting the three-point line defensively. If they can do those two things, I think Florida can be a very good team in this league, and I think they will give Kentucky problems in this matchup. So let's dive further into this matchup. What will the Wildcats do against some of these different players, against some of these different stylistic things? Maybe a little bit of a similarity here on offense with what both these teams like to do, sort of. We'll dive into all of that in just a second. Before we do that, though, I want to tell you guys about our friends over at FanDuel. The NFL regular season is wrapping up, but there is still time to get in on the action with FanDuel. It's America's #1 sports book, because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $150 in bonus bets, win or lose. The app is so easy to use. There are so many different ways to bet, like same game parlays that are live. You can find bets in the new Explore tab. You can make a parlay in the Parlay Hub, the best way to find popular parlays, by the way, if you head over to that little tab. And there's so many different more things on top of that. You need to visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a layup. That is FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. All right, continuing along here on the Friday edition of Locked On Kentucky, Lance Dawe hanging out here with you. Really appreciate you making Locked On Kentucky your first listen every single day. If you have not subscribed to the show already, please go ahead and do so. If you're listening on podcast, I would appreciate it if you sub there as well. So to recap about the Florida Gators, they've got depth. They have some height. They are aggressive on offense. They play fast. They could be better than what they are currently, I think, on offense and on defense. And they've not hit their ceiling, I don't think. They've scored at least 96 points in their last 3 contests. Offensively, they're on a roll. They return home to face the Kentucky Wildcats, who offensively are very strong in their own right. Kentucky, though, the difference here is that the Wildcats are a significantly better three-point shooting team and are a slightly more efficient two-point shooting team. Overall, they're just a better offense. Stylistically, I don't think Kentucky's going to change much about what they want to do in this game. My fear is that they will. I don't think that they're going to. I'm afraid Cal may make some adjustments. What sort of adjustments could we be looking at here? Well, I think that Kentucky, so far this season, you would agree with me when I say they're one of the best three-point shooting teams in the nation. They put up a lot of threes. They make a lot of threes. They rely on it pretty well. But there have been a couple of games where Kentucky has just decided for 75% of the matchup to just stop taking threes. And they've been competitive. These have been competitive games, or games against big-time opponents, where Kentucky has just decided, we're going to go back to what we used to do, which is just simply not run offense as well as we could. This year's personnel almost forces Kentucky to take more outside shots. And so my fear is that Cal is going to say, screw that. We're going to go inside as much as we need to. And I'm going to let these kids take mid-range shots. Florida may force Kentucky off the three-point line and force them to do more things inside. But I really do hope that this offense at the end of this game does not look inefficient and has a spray chart all across the board, and there's no sort of organization to what Kentucky's trying to do on the offensive end of the floor. Kentucky, I think, has one of the highest ceilings of any team in the country on offense. Florida doesn't force a ton of turnovers. They're good inside the rim. But outside of that, there's nothing that these Gators do other than their height and their pace of play that should change Kentucky's approach. And I'm not saying Florida has a bad defense. They've got a statistically an above average defense. But, as we said earlier, they are prone to getting into shootouts. Even against teams like, I didn't even mention Richmond, where they won that game 87-76. they have at different times this season just been able to get out and run and score, get to the rim and score. Kentucky, I think, needs to go into this game and just play like themselves on offense. Now, the rotation that Florida has down low with Samuel and Condone and Handglotten and Haw, I think they've got different guys here that can affect what the Wildcats want to do at the rim. Rebounding and scoring. But I think at the same time, Kentucky still has 4 different guards that can really attack you in similar ways and then also in different ones. Making sure that Antonio Reeves does not go cold is going to be very important in this game, I think. Making sure that he just does not completely fall off the face of the earth. Because you're going to get out and run. Both these teams are. You're going to get out and run. You're going to be aggressive. You're going to push the pace. Be you on offense. And then on defense, just protect the rim a little bit better than you have over these past couple of games, few games. And don't put this team on the foul line. I said earlier, they do a good job of getting to the foul line, but they are not a good free throw shooting team. This crowd, this energy, this momentum, the mentality that these Gators are going to have, I don't really think stuff like that, numbers-wise, matters whenever you walk into games like this. They could come in, they could take 25 free throws and make 20 of them, make 21, 22 of them. And then that could be it. That could be what decides the game. Is Kentucky's guys not knocking down their free throws and Florida just simply doing it even though they normally don't? You cannot allow Florida to overtake this game at the rim, get out and run, and fall apart on offense. Because Florida doesn't create a lot of chaos, but Kentucky can throw themselves in the chaos on their own. They don't need somebody to push them over that ledge. So just maintain yourself, control what you can control on both ends of the floor, and don't foul too much. That's my approach to this one. And I said it at the beginning of the season, and I'll say it again here. I think Kentucky wins this game. I think they do. I think Florida has potential. I think they can be very good. I think they could be a top 25 team when all is said and done. But I think that Kentucky and their personnel on offense will get enough done in this game. Kentucky's bound to have a really bad shooting night overall. Hope it doesn't come in this one. I don't think it's going to. There are a lot of people out there that are saying this is going to be a track meet. Both these teams are going to score a ton. They're going to get up there in the high 80s. Ken Palm thinks that. Torvik thinks that. I am going to go a slightly different direction. I'll say Kentucky wins. I'll say neither of these teams go above 80 to 82 points. I don't think either of these teams will. I think they'll get close, but I don't think either of them will. I'll say Kentucky scores 80, and I'll say Florida scores 77. 80 to 77 will be my final score prediction. Close game. Either team could pull away in this one, I think, because of how strong Kentucky is on offense, because of how aggressive the Gators are and comfortable in a home environment. But I'm going to take the Wildcats like I did at the beginning of the season. I'm going to ride with them still. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Give me your score predictions. Tell me what you think is going to happen in this game. Tell me what you think about the breakdown, what you think about Florida's players, Kentucky's players, etc. You can discuss all of that in the YouTube comments below. All right. That's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Kentucky. You can follow the show on Twitter at LockedOnUK. You can follow me on Twitter at LanceDawe_, and you can follow the show over on Instagram. That is at Kentucky Podcast. Any questions, comments, concerns, leave those in the YouTube comments below. Hit me on the socials. I will see you all tomorrow for a recap episode of this game. Have a great rest of your day, and God bless.